Hi, I'm Chris Wing. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Arms Control Association. I have been for quite some time. It's quite an honor. ACA, in case you haven't noticed, has an excellent staff, and it's really a pleasure to be on the board. At the moment, I'm acting chair temporarily, and I'm very pleased that I got asked to help moderate this panel, because in this panel we're moving to a really difficult question, but it's not right in the heart of the policy. It's not in the heart of what happens in Washington so much. We're talking about the question of nuclear abolition, actual nuclear disarmament. And in particular, we're talking about, given how many things are changing in the world, but given the long history of some success on addressing nuclear disarmament, addressing abolition, how should we be thinking about popular movements in support of nuclear abolition? How should we be thinking about moving toward nuclear disarmament right now? And part of what pleases me about being asked to do this is we have a really excellent combination of people. We've got Denise Duffield, who actually works at a local level. You're associate director of Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles. Daryl Kimball, who I think you know, have probably met before, and so I'm not going to waste any time. We've got a short time to introduce him further. Joan Rohlfing is the president and COO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and has been for, 10 years now or so, Joan? Longer?
Or so. A few more.
And also with solid government experience before that, which is very important. And Mian is co-director of Princeton's program on science and global security. Yes? Yes, I got it. I have known that program for a while. I should know the name by now, but it keeps going. Zia is one of those people that that's very valuable to the kind of work that we all do, because he really does function as a scientist and a researcher, but also is very involved in the community of people who work on these issues. And so this panel really, we're pulling together every sort of work on these questions from many different levels. And as I think you'll hear from people, and you will also hear, and you will hear from me, I think that any movement ultimately to get rid of nuclear weapons means we're working on every level that we can. Nothing happens only in Washington. And obviously we're going to be talking, I should say obviously, we're going to be talking about the experience. These are all folks who work in the US. We're talking about experience in the US especially. I just wanted to say two things before introducing people to, or before asking people to respond to a couple of questions. We actually collectively have a lot of experience working toward nuclear disarmament, but the moment we're in is very different than the one that many of us anyway have worked in before. And there are really two things. We don't yet know what the global security situation is going to look like. There's this sense, we have a sense, I think, that things are coming apart. Or are going to be different. They're different now, and they're going to be different in a year, perhaps, and further. But we don't quite know what that will be like. And our domestic political situation in the U.S. is profoundly different than it was, or it is obvious to us now that it's profoundly different than it was in ways that, back when I was working, in doing freeze work or working in the disarmament movement, or since then, since the 80s, it was one thing, 90s another. It's been, the negotiation of the treaty over the last decade and so on. But we're in a very different moment now. Draws on activist time are substantial. So we probably need more than 50 minutes to try to figure out what to do. But this is how we're going to proceed. Again, I have a couple of questions. I'm going to ask people to respond to them as briefly. We'll go through once, and then we'll come back with a second question. My first question is really, what have you learned from the work that you've done on nuclear issues over the last 10 years or so? What have we learned about what it takes to have popular engagement in affecting nuclear policy? So that's really the first question. I think we have a lot of good experience to draw on before turning to all the difficulties. we wanted to hear some about what people think works. So I was going to start with Daryl, then Denise, then Zia, then Joan, so, if we may.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. And this is the tough question I think that we all need to think about, is how we engage the public, how we motivate ourselves and the organizations that are part of the nuclear disarmament movement in effective actions that move us out of this very dangerous moment. So let me just mention, in my 30 years of experience, since I was, and even before when I was a student nuclear disarmament campaigner in the early 1980s, I mean, there seem to be several key things that are necessary ingredients for putting in the recipe to cook up success on nuclear disarmament, the breakthroughs that have made a difference that we've been hearing about through the course of the day. But before I go through that quick list, I mean, I think one of the things that we have to remember is, as difficult as things are, we have to remember, to coin a phrase from a guy who was also in the White House, yes, we can, because we have in the past collectively put together effective campaigns with these right ingredients that have made a huge difference. And because we have done that in the past, despite the problems that we face today, if we're smart, we work together, I think we can change the course of nuclear history once again. So, as I said, there are many ingredients that constitute an effective nuclear disarmament movement that have to be cooked up in the right way, that have to be cooked up in the right time to produce meaningful success. And in the American context, I mean, the way I think about it is we need to have widespread public concern and awareness about the dangers of nuclear weapons and arms racing, and a sense that personal engagement, personal action can somehow make a difference. We need to have bold and smart leadership from the president, not just nice words. We need actual action and commitment and some political risk-taking to move the ball forward. We need to achieve success, ideally bipartisan leadership from enough members of Congress. And when we have a coordinated and focused and socially and politically diverse set of organizations and networks in Washington, across the country, working together, we can focus public pressure and attention to push policymakers to take the actions that make a difference. We need the right ideas, and there are a lot of ideas out there right now about how to move the ball forward. There's not necessarily agreement in what we think of as the movement, and I think that's part of our challenge, is how do we come together around a focused set of key ideas that engage the public, that are effective, and that are achievable over the next 5 to 10 years. And so, success is also requires coordination amongst some of the key organizations and leaders of organizations like ACA and NTI and others to be working collaboratively rather than competitively. And I think there is a lot of collaborative spirit, but we don't necessarily have the organizational capacity right now to align our strategies within the organizations that work primarily in Washington, but also across the country. And we need to work harder to develop that. And then, of course, success depends a whole lot on luck, historical circumstances. Mikhail Gorbachev coming on the scene in 1985, 86, 87, that changed the course of history. That's not something we can plan for. But we can plan for, as High Representative Nakamitsu said, we can plan for the moment when the engagement between the great powers resumes, when there is an event that focuses the public mind on the problem, just as we've seen over the last few weeks. We need to be ready to move forward together to push for the actions that are necessary to reduce nuclear risk and to move towards the goal of the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. So those are some of the key ingredients. I think we got to keep that in mind as we talk about and think about how we work together.
Okay, thank you, Daryl. Denise, from where you sit, what have you seen that you feel is will help guide us forward?
Well, for the last 4 years, I've been deeply involved in a campaign called Back from the Brink, bringing communities together to abolish nuclear weapons. And what this campaign is, it is a campaign for nuclear abolition. We organize around a set of a policy platform. We call them policy solutions. But really, it's about making clear that nuclear weapons are a local issue and that local communities have and must have a say in nuclear policy, which many people don't know that there's something that they can do about it. The campaign also is heavily focused on approaching municipal governments and state governments and asking them to adopt resolutions that support our policy platform, and that those efforts are led throughout the country by grassroots activists. So even though there's a steering committee that coordinates back from the brink, it may be Pax Christi that's organizing a resolution in one city. It may be Veterans for Peace that's organizing that in another city. Many different groups that get involved. What's even more exciting is when these groups can build coalitions and sort of break down the silos that we're in. Because I'm a local organizer, I worked a lot on the cleanup of the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. I know how the city politics works. I know how the state legislature works. I have relationships with environmental justice groups, with racial justice groups, with climate groups. So when it came time for the Los Angeles resolution to happen, we could draw on that. We could bring together Habakasha, we could bring the faith community in, we could bring veterans in, we could bring students in, and we did. And what we're finding is that on this local level, this is intended to influence decision makers. Members of Congress have asked us, look, I have town hall meetings, I don't hear anything about nuclear anything. We really need you guys to do this. They're not going to make any of these policies a priority if they're not hearing it from their constituents. And so more and more we want to be able to say, these cities in your district, this state that you're in, these organizations. Now we have state and local elected officials who are also coming on board. So this is Boston, Minneapolis, Tucson, Salt Lake City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, of course. Baltimore was the first major city to adopt a resolution. These resolutions are also sent on to members of Congress. They're an extraordinarily powerful organizing tool, not just at the municipal level, but also with talking to other organizations. And so trying to really build our capacity that way. And again, this we really, particularly at this moment that you mentioned, with so much on the line, when children are being slaughtered, when people can't go to church or the grocery store in certain communities without being at risk of losing their lives, that we talk about security in terms of human security, and not what we think is possible, what we know is necessary, and that is the abolition of nuclear weapons. So I'm very excited about this campaign and the lessons that we continue to learn as it grows and as it evolves, particularly this distributed organizing model we're doing. And I would say also on the national level, another thing that we're doing also to break out of the silo is we're partnering with the Poor People's Campaign. They have their Moral March coming up on June 18th. And this is, they refer to a moral fusion model of organizing. And it's been incredibly powerful to be in some of the planning meetings and have, reproductive rights activists, with labor, with environmental, with, income inequality, with the faith movement, to have us all together. Because I think where we're at as a country right now is single issues are not, I can't see us having a big win somewhere and all these other things. I think we need to come together. So everybody brings their expertise, everybody sort of stays in their lanes, but we join together and we support each other at moments when it counts. So that's what
And
what
so
I'm
it's not
excited
either
about.
or. You're not sort of
No.
saying to a local activist, either you got to work on what we're going to do about democracy.
No,
or
we show
work
up for
on-
each other. So
Yeah.
maybe you're going to pass a resolution or a state legislative bill, and another group is coming there with something about housing. We'll stay and we'll voice support on that, and we'll build the relationships that we need to move forward.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. That's a great start. Zia, what's on your mind?
Failure.
I know that, yeah, all right, go ahead.
I mean, one has to accept the inevitable fact that, we're celebrating 50 years of the Arms Control Association. So as people have mentioned, this was also when the first strategic arms limitation agreement was signed, capping the number of strategic nuclear weapons, and the signing of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was said to be proof of the victory of arms control as a way of thinking about national security in the United States. It's also when Nixon went to China. It's also the year when the first Stockholm Conference on the Environment took place and made environmental issues a global issue. And look where we are now. We're still here, the Arms Control Association. The ABM Treaty has been gone for 20 years. So what happened to the proof of the victory of arms control as the cornerstone of American national security, when even the Kissingers and the McNamara said it would be a disaster to undo this? And Washington undid it anyway. As they were told, the expansion of NATO after the Cold War would be a disaster, and they did it anyway. And the Stockholm Conference, we've had thousands of scientists pour their heart out with explaining the terrible consequences of what we're doing with our fossil fuel economies. And yet, here we are. We still do not have anywhere close to the kind of action that would actually address the real problem. And we could go on, we could talk about Roe v. Wade, we could talk about racial justice, we could talk about gun violence. So both at the domestic level and at the global level, we actually have a crisis of the legitimacy of the institutions that govern the world and
Yes,
this
we do.
country.
Yes, we do.
And for me, we have to start with that fact. In a funny sort of way, that was also the problem in 1970, 71, 72 because of the Vietnam War. People in America and many people around the world saw a crisis of responsibility. Are these people and these institutions fit to be responsible for managing our societies and our lives? And when you go back and read the histories of that time, you realize that that sense of a crisis of the legitimacy of how things are managed and who's in charge and how they manage things was central to the politics of that time. And I think we need to reclaim that as a central element of what we're doing now. And I say this with great respect for everybody in the room and who've done so much work, but as the American political scientist Robert Dahl pointed out a long time ago in his book about controlling nuclear weapons, there were these two models, the model of guardianship, where there is a small group of elite experts, both inside and outside government, that talk to each other and tell everybody, you have to trust us to manage this because we are both reasonable and prudent and we're doing it in everybody's best interest. So morally we are, okay. And then there is the democratic control issue. And Dahl said that in the United States, the guardianship problem is actually acute. And one thing that has happened in the past 50 years in a variety of issues, not just ours, is that we have become part of the structure of guardianship.
The structure of
Of guardianship,
guardianship.
right? The professionalization of dissent and contentious politics on nuclear weapons and on many other issues has meant that many organizations and ways of thinking are now part of this inside-outside process of people going into the government and coming out to an NGO or a think tank, people writing policy papers for each other, making sure that everybody accepts what is reasonable. And that domestication of dissent limits the kinds of things that we are possibly able to imagine and do with these existing structures. So I'm in a very privileged position that, Princeton is not in DC, it's far away. I sit in a university. So I don't really have to deal with all of that aspect of it. But I think it also gives a perspective. And so I think for me, one of the things I've learned is that we actually have to rediscover some of the more difficult challenges involved in contentious politics and actually be much more focused on our own relationship to the structures of power and authority and how they limit what we think is reasonable to talk about and ask about. And here I think that, we have to remember that it wasn't so long ago that you had almost all the conditions that Daryl quite rightly outlined. You had a president who talked about the moral responsibility of the United States to give up nuclear weapons. The first president of the United States ever to go to Hiroshima. And yet, what changed? And so I want to kind of just conclude by this, that if you wanted to look at an example of things that worked, I'd point to two things. One is that you look at the success of an organization like ICANN, right? Which was founded based on an idea by a Malaysian doctor, taken up by a group in Australia, with an agenda that was unthinkable in nuclear weapon states, by and large. Let's just do zero. No step by step, let's just do zero. And they worked with people outside the United States with great success. And so one thing we might want to think about is that if we can't manage our own governmental structures, perhaps it's time for the United States to ask for help, right? Hey guys, we are really stuck. Please help, send the cavalry, right?
Yeah,
Please send Elaine Gomez-White. Please send, lots and lots of activists and diplomats and experts from where you do have experience in how to make fundamental change and help bail us out. And the other thing is you look at the kind of work that 350.org and others have done. What it took to stop the XL pipeline and all of these things is those are the kinds of things the peace movement used to do, right? And I think that's the last comment, and I'll stop here, is we need to think about how to reimagine ourselves, not as the nuclear security community or the nuclear policy community, but ask ourselves, are we a peace movement or not? And what is our relationship to the movement, and what kind of movement, and where are we with relationship to that? So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I have a feeling we're not going to quite get to the end of the whole conversation here. But one of the things I wanted to say just before going to Joan is that this is the value of having these four folks on the up here, because we're all working from and from different. I mean, what you're talking about, Zia, what Denise is doing is fundamental to answering some of the questions I think that you're raising, and we can get to that later. But Joan, so here you are in Washington.
Thank you. Yes, alas, I might say most days.
It's pretty hot.
But I do love it here. So there's way more to say than we have time for. Let me try and hit a couple of key points. And Zia, thank you for your critical assessment. I agree 100% with it. And I would say, I think one of the most important things we need to do when we look at our lack of success, our lack of strategic success over a multi-decadal period, is to do a deep dive examination of the nuclear system and all of the elements that hold it in place. What are the key dynamics and behaviors that are trapping us in a cycle that we can't seem to get out of? And one of the observations I would make about the system is that it is undemocratic at every level, right? Power is held by a small number of elite in a small number of states, and yet the consequences of nuclear use affect all of humanity. And so we do need to find a way to democratize nuclear weapons, to make them more accessible, to reach more people, to make nuclear issues relevant for our political leaders, to make it necessary for them to respond, to learn about these issues, and to help build the political will that we need for change. So I'll make another observation about how do we do that. I think, by the way, I would also just mention, Daryl, that there hasn't always been consensus. There still isn't consensus in our community. We're not monolithic. We are pretty diverse. But there hasn't been consensus around the importance of a social movement. And so we haven't coordinated well. We have thrown our energy into doing that at points in our history. But many of us, particularly those of us in Washington, have been playing this inside, what I call an inside baseball strategy, thinking that if we can only persuade, a few key decision makers, we can crack the whole nut, we can solve the whole problem. And as you point out, Zia, even having helped bring to the presidency Barack Obama, there were limits to what he could do. And that's what has driven us into a deep dive around, well, if he couldn't do it, right, what are the other aspects, behaviors, and dynamics of the system that need to be disrupted. The lack of a social movement is only one. I think there are entrenched financial interests, there are entrenched institutional interests, there's a very deeply entrenched way of thinking about nuclear weapons that is deeply rooted in a belief in nuclear deterrence. And as long as we remain deeply committed to nuclear deterrence forever, we can never, I mean, it's a circular logic that traps us in having to have nuclear weapons forever. We're never going to be able to reach the end point of a world where nuclear weapons are prohibited. So what can we do on the social movement side? I think that must be a priority. And NTI, in order to better understand how we can help build a social movement, have done a couple of rounds of deep research, not traditional polling, but a kind of deeper sort of cultural audit to understand how the American public thinks about nuclear weapons. And there were I'm going to mention two top-level takeaways from that research. First is that 75 to 80% of the American public is already bought into a world without nuclear weapons. We don't really have to make the sale on that. I mean, of course, it would be good if there was more nuance in understanding how bad it might really be, but people already want that world. There's a high level of despair about the multiple crises that we find ourselves in. People are living with a high level of anxiety and despair about the future. But only half of the population, roughly 50%, believe that a world without nuclear weapons is possible. And an even smaller number, about 30%, believe they have any agency at all to affect that outcome. And one of the biggest obstacles, the biggest roadblocks standing in the way of people believing that they have any agency is no one has given them a hopeful, feasible vision of what a future without nuclear weapons would look like. So, you know, for me, I think the number one thing we need to do is to be better as a community about conveying the hopeful vision. Let's give people kind of more fidelity about what that vision looks like and help them understand that it's possible. It's not some not in my lifetime pipe dream. I think that's really crucial. So I'll stop there because I know we want to go to a next phase of the discussion.
Yeah, and it's hard to jump right from here to talking about, okay, so what can we do in the next 5 to 10 years, you know, because actually we're putting very big questions on the table, I would say. In terms of what Joan was just talking about, I mean, this is something that permeates our politics, and actually it's not just recent in terms of, there are many things to which 75 to 80% of the people in the country would say, yes, I agree with you, but the decisions made in Washington have resolutely gone against that. It's not just on nukes, it's not just on abortion rights, it's not just on gun rights. It's so there is something in the political process that we cannot actually ignore. And so part of the question, I guess, and starting again with Denise, from where you sit and from working locally, you're describing a situation where you feel that there's energy. And so how do you respond to the things to Zia, the way the discussion, the points that Zia and Joan have made about the difficulty? Because you've been working locally and at the state level. That doesn't yet make it to the federal level, but...
Oh, but it does.
It
does. You know, we, for example, I would talk about this, but when we met with Adam Schiff to talk about co-sponsoring a No First Use bill, we were able to talk about the resolutions. We were able to bring a very diverse, in terms of arenas, group of people to talk to him. And it's meant, that's what it's meant for. I couldn't agree more with Zia. I don't have an answer for how we fundamentally change the government right now. All I know is that all social change movements have had at their base, at their root, organizing. We work from the bottom up, and that's what we're trying to do, and fuse that with other folks that are also organizing for a better future, for a more hopeful future. We have groups like 350, we have Sierra Club, we have over 400 organizations that have endorsed the campaign that we too can call upon. especially the ones that have chapters in different areas. And what I think what we lack the most is capacity. The grassroots which I think holds the key to the kingdom in terms of actually real change, is enormously under-resourced. And we are putting out many fires, which is why I think this coming together that's happening in a couple weeks here is so important. You've seen for the Women's March, for the March on Science, you'll see signs for everything, immigrants, right? Everything in the world. You won't see peace or nuclear disarmament. We're changing that and sort of entering into what may eventually, at some point, need to be quite confrontational in terms of how our government is structured and true participatory democracy.
So I know, well, Zia, so what do you think about, where will your focus be over the next 6 to 12 months? On the assumption that you put your time and energy into things you think are, have some promise.
If only one had the privilege of focus, given the state of the world.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's, but let me kind of try and follow on from what Joan and Denise just said. It seems to me that what I'm trying to get at, however incoherently, is that for a long time we've thought about nuclear weapons and many other issues as issues of policy. Not as issues of democracy. And I would make the case that right now, all of these different strands of contention, the single issue causes, movements, groups that we've seen struggling in so many ways in the United States and more broadly, do reflect an increasingly shared sense about what I was saying. It's a legitimacy crisis about democracy, about people's ability to shape their lives and the conditions of their lives. And in that respect, I think that one of the things that as a community, with all our differences, as Joan rightly points out, and also all the other organizations that Denise is working with and others are working with, and as I said, folks around the world who are working on their issues, is to think about how to have a conversation about democracy. Because, thinking about, what can we do to move this member of Congress and get a piece of legislation through a committee, et cetera, we've realized how vulnerable all of that is. I mean, once upon a time, it was assumed that we would go step by step through one arms control treaty after the next arms control treaty. But each one was seen to be an anchor on, a foundation on which we would build the next thing. And it turns out that the rug can actually be pulled out from under your feet. They were not as solid as we had ever imagined them to be. And in the larger scale, the entire world system is going through a profound transition, which was never imagined in the ways in which many of these agreements were set up. The United States has moved from a position of parity to hegemony now to being defensive about the future. And, so we have to keep all of those things in mind. But I think that we actually need to have a conversation about the need to build anti-systemic movements, right? Go back to the another world is possible kind of ways of thinking, but relevant to our time now, and actually ask the questions about, all of these social movements that we have, all of these policy crises we have, actually are the rise of authoritarianism in many countries and populism, all speak to an issue about democracy. And so we have to think about how does the peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement, everybody have a conversation about what kind of relationship do we as people want to have about democracy and the role of democracy in managing societies. That may actually lead to new kinds of possibilities. And so I think that would be where I would look for resources for hope and action.
Though I had told Daryl that I didn't think I'd call on him in the second round, I'm going to because he looks like he has something to say.
Yes, well, thank you, Chris, for indulging me. You've heard a lot from me today. Let me offer a thought to build on what Zia is saying. So, we've had a little bit of discussion earlier today in our previous discussions about what the war in Ukraine, what questions it brings up, how we should respond to Vladimir Putin's threats of nuclear use. And so if we're trying to catalyze a conversation about democracy and the lack of democracy in decisions about nuclear weapons, I mean, one of the key issues I think we need to be driving on and asking questions about is the issue of nuclear deterrence and how sustainable is this concept of international security. If you've been reading Arms Control Today, I've been writing about this in the post-Russia-Ukraine war situation. But that is the fundamental question that this crisis raises that we need to begin thinking about. And so over the next 6 to 12 months, I mean, this is one of the fundamental questions that I think we as a quote-unquote community, and a community is used with a small c in a broad sense, need to be asking questions about. It is a 5 to 10 year long strategy we need to be pursuing. That's one aspect, but I think it's an important aspect. And then finally, just a quick note, as Zia says, the arms control institutions that have been, and regimes that have been built up over the years that we've been talking about all day, that we're celebrating away, yes, they are vulnerable. We cannot take them for granted. And every generation, I'm paraphrasing Coretta Scott King, every generation needs to fight for justice and freedom. Every generation needs to win their victories. And so we are going forward. We need to think about how we rebuild some of those arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation institutions. We need to build them better. But we need to recognize, as you said, Zia, that these are not etched in stone, and we're not necessarily going to be able to build on them step by step. And one of the elements is the TPNW. Another element is the taboo against nuclear weapons, which we talked about this morning. And another element, I think, is the simple idea that nuclear armed states must continue to pursue their legal obligation to negotiate on ways to end the arms race and achieve nuclear disarmament, which is Article 6 of the NPT. So these are some kind of fundamental things that I think can bind us together to try to tackle some of the huge issues that we're talking about here over the next, whether it's 6 to 12 months or longer.
So Daryl is, in some ways, is saying that there are actually also some sort of substantive or policy issues that we don't know, that we haven't yet
Defined.
thought through.
Right.
So Joan, for you and an organization like NTI, is that a useful notion that maybe we don't, that maybe we haven't figured everything out, and there are things that, in addition to your concern about how you build and shape popular opinion, are there things that in the last 12 months you have come to focus on substantively more, for example, about deterrence? I mean, are you...
Oh, we're deeply invested
yes,
in that
yes,
right
so
now.
talk a little about what you think
Totally.
is,
Over the
yeah.
last several years,
Yeah.
we've been really critically examining and challenging this deeply held and deeply entrenched belief system. I think Daryl...
Do you see that as an elite discussion? I mean,
No,
who do you see
it's not at all. At the moment, it's more of an internal discussion and a discussion in a few small forums where we find people interested in engaging in this. I mean, I agree with you, Daryl. I think it's crucial for us to ask and answer the question about how sustainable is nuclear deterrence. The smartass in me would say it's perfectly sustainable. It's like a self-replicating virus. It is so resilient, right? It just keeps coming back and back and back. But humanity is not resilient in the face of a system which is premised on mass annihilation and therefore has risk baked into its DNA. And when the system fails, and I say when because I think just mathematically, it's a matter of time before the system will fail, and we will have to manage a global catastrophe. It's possible, and shame on us, if we cannot, as a community, develop a better system for managing nuclear technology, one that is, when I say nuclear technology, I mean both peaceful and nuclear weapons technology. We're not going to uninvent that. We have to figure out how we can live with it as humanity in perpetuity, but in a way that it doesn't threaten us. And I think we're lucky to live in a period where for all of the challenges that we're confronting today, we have many new tools available to us that we didn't have before in terms of technological tools that can enable us to do detection and monitoring and verification of the non-production of nuclear weapons, and that can get us on the other side of this equation to a state of nuclear prohibition at some point. So we're investing a lot of our time and energy in not only understanding the dynamics that hold deterrence in place to be smarter about how we can disrupt that and get us to a better place, but then also envisioning and developing the roadmap, not just the roadmap, how we get there, but what does that end state look like? Let's define it with way more fidelity than just an expression of, wouldn't it be nice to have a world without nuclear weapons? Many of us, if not maybe all of us in this room, might agree with that destination, but we have to do more than just state the end point. And I wanted to just say, also very briefly come back to the coordination point, because I think it's really crucial that, as a small community that's under extreme stress at the moment because of the loss of funders, we have to leverage our time and our effort and our resources by being much better coordinated with each other. So I wanted to foot stomp that observation by Daryl.
I also would say that the role of organizations that are I think of an organization like ACA as an advocacy nonprofit in Washington. When there's a lot going on in the country, then that pulls the advocacy groups into a different relationship with policymakers, and they serve a different role in relation to organizations on the ground. And ideally, we will be again at some point in a situation where there is more of that communication, where it's where the work that's going on locally is connected and I know you all talk. I don't mean that there's no connection, but it's not yet, or it hasn't been for a while. That sort of, I think that it's very easy to There are important things for nonprofits in Washington to do, even when there's not a big, huge grassroots organization. But the strength really lies in being able to link, not just with each other in Washington, but also with each other and with people working around the country and with researchers. I think that you may have noticed that we didn't ask for questions, and the reason was that we had 50 minutes for this panel, and it did not seem realistic. 50 minutes, 4 speakers, and I was crabby, so so that's why I wasn't going to call on Daryl a second time, because I figured he's got lots of chances to say what's going on. But we actually, believe it or not, even though we have just started to scratch the surface, I think we are pretty much winding up. And I wanted to give you all an opportunity, but not a requirement, if you want to sort of make one final sort of comment. I'll start down at the end with Zia, because he's had to be quiet for a little bit. No, I mean, I haven't called you. Yeah.
Sometimes it's good to be quiet.
It is sometimes good. Yeah.
Albert Camus famously said that sometimes the only thing you can do is be silent.
That's right. That's absolutely true.
But I think that the issue for me fundamentally comes down to that organizations and groups working in the United States need to rethink their relationship of power with the rest of the world.
Yes.
And begin by putting ourselves in a position of humility and say, we made the world in large measure. The mess is our doing. We can't fix it. Please come help us figure out together how to try and fix it.
Doris Lessing wrote a book along these lines many, many years ago. How about you, Denise? Do you have anything you would like to add?
I think I just like to stress the importance of leadership in moments like this. Leadership on all levels. Some of the city councils that we've approached to have people that want to be involved, that want to be leaders. There used to be a city council member we had named Alex Padilla. He became a state senator, a state legislator. Now he's a state senator. It matters, when we're talking to and developing leaders that can be force multipliers in a good way, and hoping that that will also lead to what we really need, which is leadership in Congress. People who, like in the Freeze movement, took this issue on and made it their issue. And so I think, again, things seem to be falling apart at the seams, and maybe they will, and something better will emerge from the ashes. But in the meantime, right now, I think that there's a crisis of leadership too, and that our group is trying to foster that, to be that, but to foster that back from the brink, again, at all levels, from community leaders to elected officials on up.
Great. Joan, do you want to say anything more?
Yes.
Please.
Which is, we've been talking about really difficult issues during a really difficult period, and it's easy to feel hopeless. And so maybe I will offer a word of hope, dare I say, which is, and this might sound like I'm in denial. Daryl and I were talking about earlier how we get our jobs done because we can tune out the rest of the world on many days. But I really believe our community is positioned at a point of significant opportunity right now. And we're at this point because of the multiple crises that are happening. Because of the pandemic, because of the Ukraine crisis, people waking up to how fragile the world is and how endangered we all are. We also see technological trends that are giving us new tools, and the fact that our field is in crisis is forcing us to rethink our strategy and to collaborate in ways that we haven't had to in the past. And so I'm actually very optimistic that we may be on the verge of some very significant change, and that we can collectively make some significant impact in this space. So I wanted to share that.
Thank you. Daryl, do you have anything you want to say now? Or?
I think that's a good note to end on,
Yeah,
Chris.
I do too. I would like to.